It all started with a laugh. Not mine, his. I remember the exact moment. How I was nursing a beer after a long day at the office, just trying to unwind. My colleague, Jason, was at the bar with me, cracking jokes and regaling the group with one of his many conquests. You'd think we were still in college the way he bragged about women like they were trophies to be paraded around. This time, though, something in his voice made me pause. He leaned in with that smug grin of his, eyes gleaming with satisfaction, and said, "You know, fellas, there's something special about sneaking around. A little risk, a little thrill. Especially when she's married." Everyone laughed, of course. It was Jason, after all. Everyone knew what to expect from him. But I felt something twist in my gut. It wasn't jealousy. It was something darker. A small, nagging thought. Married women? I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my pulse had quickened. That's low, man. Jason just shrugged. Like it was nothing. Hey, what can I say? I'm irresistible, he said with a wink, then lowered his voice. Besides, it's not like her husband knows. Poor guy's probably clueless. The group erupted into laughter again, but my mind was somewhere else. I had no idea why, but my brain had latched onto that statement like it was a clue. Why did this bother me so much? It was a stupid story, one I'd heard 100 times from Jason. But this time it felt different. I didn't say anything more that night, but as I drove home, my thoughts started spiraling. Rachel, my wife of 5 years, had been acting strange lately. She had always been a bit distant, her own person with her own interests, but this was different. She'd been more distracted. There were late nights, unexpected work dinners, and those damn text notifications that she would hide as soon as I glanced over. I never considered myself the jealous type. We'd always had trust, or at least I thought we did. But ever since Jason's little confession, my mind wouldn't stop racing. Not because I thought Jason was involved, no, that would be too ridiculous, but because the idea of my wife, Rachel, cheating on me, it suddenly didn't feel impossible. Could she? No. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Rachel wouldn't do that. She couldn't. We had our issues, sure, but nothing like this. Still, the seed had been planted. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Watching her movements, the way she'd smile at her phone, the way she'd leave the room to take calls. It was all subtle, but now that I was looking for it, I couldn't unsee it. One night, after she had gone to bed, I found myself alone on the couch, just staring at her phone. She always kept it close. She was careful. But tonight, she'd left it on the kitchen counter. It was just sitting there, tempting me, daring me. I shouldn't have done it. But at that moment, the doubt had grown too large to ignore. I grabbed her phone, hands trembling, and tried to unlock it. Of course, I didn't know her passcode. It wasn't like we had a habit of going through each other's stuff. But then I realized her birthday. She'd mentioned once that she used it for everything. The screen lit up. My stomach turned. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but I started scrolling through her messages. There were chats with friends, family, nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw a thread with a number saved as J. No photo, no last name, just J. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my fingers were shaking as I opened the chat. It didn't take long for the truth to punch me in the gut. The messages were flirty, intimate, too intimate. They talked about meeting up, about sneaking around. And then I saw it, the one message that made my blood run cold. I can't wait to see you again, babe. Miss you so much. Friday? It wasn't much. No name. No identifying details. But it was enough. Enough to confirm what I had been dreading. Rachel was cheating on me. I put the phone down, quietly, like it might explode if I didn't handle it gently. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at it. My thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief, anger, and pain. I wanted to scream, to wake her up and confront her right then and there. But I couldn't. I didn't even know what to say. Instead, I sat back down on the couch, my head in my hands. Couldn't believe it. The woman I loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was seeing someone else. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind playing back every moment, every laugh, every touch that suddenly felt like a lie. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had changed. But everything had. I was trapped in my own head, wondering what to do next, how to even process the betrayal. And the worst part? I couldn't stop thinking about revenge. I didn't know what form it would take, but I wanted her to hurt like I was hurting. And that's when things got worse. Because the next time I saw Jason, he made an offer I never saw coming. An offer that would change everything. I went into work the next day with a heavy chest and a head full of anger I didn't know how to deal with. Rachel had kissed me goodbye that morning, like she always did, and I had to force a smile. It felt wrong. Like everything I knew about my life was crumbling before my eyes. But I didn't say a word. At the office, I couldn't focus. Every email, every conversation, it all blurred together. I kept replaying those messages over and over in my mind. Who was Jay? Was it someone I knew? Someone from her work? I had no answers. Just an ever-growing storm of questions that gnawed at me. Jason, of course, was his usual obnoxious self. He strolled into the break room, talking too loudly about his weekend plans, oblivious to the fact that I was barely holding it together. I wanted to punch him, to scream at him for his casual attitude toward cheating, but I couldn't. I didn't even know why I was so angry at him. He wasn't involved in my mess, after all. It wasn't his fault. But then, out of nowhere, Jason turned to me, a sly grin creeping across his face. "Hey man, you alright? You've been kinda off lately," he said, leaning against the counter with that trademark smirk. Trouble in paradise? I could feel the heat rising in my face. I wasn't about to unload everything onto Jason of all people, but the tension must have been visible because he didn't let it go. "Come on, dude. Talk to me. What's going on?" he pressed, and for a second, his grin softened, like he was genuinely concerned. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the frustration, or maybe I just needed to say it out loud to make it real. But before I could stop myself, I was telling him about Rachel, about the texts, about how I didn't know who she was sneaking around with. Jason's eyebrows shot up as he listened, and when I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Damn, man, that's rough," he said, shaking his head. "You sure she's cheating, though? I mean, it could be nothing." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in my own ears. "I saw the messages. She's definitely cheating." Jason was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "Well, that's messed up. But if you want, I know a way to get back at her." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Jason looked around, as if making sure no one else could hear, then leaned in closer. "Hear me out," he said, his voice low. "I've been seeing someone on the side, right? Let's just say she's open to new experiences. What if we set something up? You, me, and her. You know, get your mind off Rachel for a bit. A little revenge. What do you think?" I stared at him, my brain trying to process what he was saying. Did he just suggest a threesome? Was he serious? "Wait, are you kidding me right now?" I asked, not sure if I was about to laugh or punch him in the face. Jason shrugged again, that cocky grin reappearing. "Why not? Look man, I get it, you're pissed. But sometimes the best way to deal with this kind of thing is to turn the tables. Make her feel the same kind of betrayal. Plus, my girl's into it. She won't care. Hell, she'll probably enjoy it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A part of me wanted to tell him to shove it, to walk out and never speak to him again. But another part, the angry, bitter part, was listening. Rachel had betrayed me. Maybe Jason was right. Maybe I needed to even the score. If she could sneak around behind my back, why shouldn't I do the same? Still, I hesitated. "I don't know, man," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. "This isn't exactly my style." Jason laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. "I get it, but think about it. Okay? No pressure. Just know the offer's on the table." I nodded, even though my mind was screaming at me to walk away. But when I left the office that day, Jason's words stayed with me. Could I really go through with something like that? Would it help me feel better? Or would it just make things worse? I drove home in a daze, my thoughts spinning in 100 different directions. When I walked through the door, Rachel was in the kitchen, making dinner like nothing was wrong. She smiled at me, asked about my day, and for a moment, I almost forgot about everything. Almost. But then the doubt crept back in, darker and more suffocating than before. Every time she looked at her phone, every time she stepped out of the room, my chest tightened with suspicion. Couldn't live like this. I couldn't let her get away with what she was doing. The next day at work, I found Jason by the coffee machine. Before I could talk myself out of it, the words were spilling out of my mouth. All right, let's do it. Jason's grin spread slowly across his face, satisfied and smug. Good choice, man. You won't regret this. But deep down, I already knew I would. I spent the rest of the week in a fog. Agreeing to Jason's offer felt surreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I wasn't the kind of guy who did things like this. I was the quiet, loyal husband, the one who tried to make his marriage work, even when things got tough. But now, I felt like I was spiraling, and I didn't know how to stop it. At home, Rachel acted as if everything was perfectly fine. She kissed me on the cheek in the mornings, asked about my day, and laughed at the same TV shows we always watched together. But every time I looked at her, all I could see were those messages. The ones she sent to him, whoever he was, felt like a lie, like I was living with a stranger. It was during one of those quiet moments, Rachel humming softly to herself in the kitchen, her phone face down on the counter, that the anger hit me again, stronger than before. She had betrayed me. She was sneaking around, doing God knows what, and I was just sitting here, letting it happen. Jason's offer had seemed insane at first, but now it felt like the only thing that made sense. If she could cheat on me, why shouldn't I get a little revenge? The next day at work, Jason approached me with a knowing grin. You ready for tomorrow night? He asked, his voice low but laced with excitement. I hadn't forgotten. Tomorrow, the day we were supposed to meet up with his girl. I nodded, though my stomach churned at the thought. Yeah, I guess. Jason clapped me on the back. Trust me, man, you're gonna feel a lot better after this. I'll text you the details later. That night, I could barely look at Rachel. She was curled up on the couch, flipping through her phone, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I had already started to convince myself that she deserved this. She was the one sneaking around. She was the one who broke our marriage. So why did I feel so guilty? The next day was a blur. I went through the motions at work, barely hearing what anyone said, my mind fixated on what was coming. Around lunchtime, Jason slid his phone across the table toward me. Here's the address. Meet me there at 8. I glanced at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. It was real. This was actually happening. Yeah. Okay, I muttered, pocketing my phone and trying to steady my nerves. That evening, I told Rachel I had to work late. She didn't question it. In fact, she barely glanced up from her phone as I left, her eyes glued to whatever conversation she was having. For all I knew, it could have been him again. The thought made my blood boil. As I drove to the address Jason had given me, a sick feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. What was I doing? Was this really the answer? Part of me wanted to turn the car around, to go home and confront Rachel instead of playing this twisted game. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was this far in. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, just a few miles from where I lived. It was unremarkable. A simple two-story with a dark driveway and a single light on in the front room. Jason's car was already there when I pulled up. I parked behind him, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine. Before I could psych myself out, Jason appeared at the door, grinning like we were about to go on some kind of adventure. Hey man, come on in. She's already inside, waiting. I swallowed the lump in my throat and followed him through the door. The house smelled faintly of perfume, a scent that was unfamiliar but oddly comforting in its own way. Jason led me down a hallway, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. As we reached the bedroom door, Jason turned to me, his grin wider than ever. You ready for this? He asked, his voice thick with anticipation. I didn't answer. Couldn't. My throat was too dry, my mind too scattered. Jason pushed the door open, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. And there she was, lying on the bed, draped in nothing but a thin sheet, was Rachel. My wife. I froze. My brain couldn't catch up with what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be. But there she was, looking up at me with wide eyes, her face pale as the realization hit her too. Rachel, I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. Jason's laugh from behind me shattered the silence. Surprise, he said, stepping past me into the room, completely oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off in my head. Rachel scrambled to cover herself with the sheet, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find words. But what could she say? There was nothing to explain. The truth was naked, lying in front of me, as real and raw as the betrayal that coursed through my veins. I had come here to get revenge on my wife's infidelity, and now I was staring straight at her in my colleague's bedroom, ready to sleep with her as part of his sick game. Wait, I whispered, my legs giving out as I stumbled back against the wall. You're the mistress? Rachel's face crumpled, and she looked away, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. The silence was enough. Jason, still clueless, chuckled and shrugged. Well, now that the introductions are over, how about we? Shut up, I screamed, the anger boiling over in a way I hadn't expected. Jason stepped back, startled, his eyes flicking between Rachel and me, finally realizing that something had gone horribly wrong. Rachel finally spoke, her voice barely audible. I didn't know it was going to be you. The weight of her words crushed me. My chest felt like it was caving in, the realization of what I had walked into hitting me all at once. I had no idea this was coming. No idea that the woman Jason had been bragging about all along was my wife. And she had no idea I was the man she was about to cheat on me with. I stood there, frozen, my mind scrambling to make sense of the nightmare unraveling before my eyes. My body wanted to move, to react, to do something, but I was paralyzed. How had it come to this? How had my life spiraled into such a mess? Rachel was sobbing quietly now, clutching the sheet to her chest like it could somehow shield her from the truth. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization of what she had done. But what about me? What was I supposed to do? Jason, still oblivious to the emotional bomb that had just detonated, scratched his head awkwardly. Okay. I think maybe I'll give you 2 a minute, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable for the first time in his life. I glared at him, my anger rising, but I couldn't even speak. Words seemed useless. I wanted to lash out at him, at Rachel, at the universe for twisting everything into this sick joke. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my chest heavy with disbelief. Jason backed out of the room, closing the door behind him, leaving Rachel and me alone. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I was staring at the floor, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to break me, while Rachel wiped at her tears, her body trembling under the thin sheet. She finally broke the silence. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I didn't know, Matt. I swear I didn't know it was you. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how that made any of this better. But I couldn't. The words just wouldn't come. My mind was spinning in 1,000 directions. How had I ended up here, in a bedroom with my wife, who had been sneaking around with my colleague? A colleague who had now unknowingly dragged me into the middle of his twisted affair? I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she continued, her voice cracking with guilt. I was just so lonely, Matt. You were always working late, always distracted, and I made a horrible mistake. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She had been lonely? She had been hurting? I wanted to understand, I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could explain what she had done. But deep down, I knew it didn't change the reality of what was happening now. She had betrayed me. She had lied. And now we were here on the edge of something we could never come back from. You cheated on me? I said finally, my voice cold and distant. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, flat and emotionless, as if saying it out loud would make it easier to accept. Rachel's sobs deepened, and she shook her head, her hair falling in messy strands over her face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The apology hung in the air like a weight, but it did nothing to lift the crushing sense of betrayal I felt. I could still see those messages in my head, the flirtations, the plans to meet up behind my back. And then, the sick realization that she had been the one Jason was bragging about all along. My wife was the woman he had been sneaking around with, the one he had laughed about while we all sat there, completely clueless. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" Rachel hesitated, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "A few months," she choked out. It started after your promotion, when you began working late all the time, and we barely saw each other." I clenched my fists, anger coursing through me. "So that's your excuse?" I snapped. "I was working late to support us, Rachel. I was doing it for us. And you repay me by crawling into bed with Jason." Her shoulders shook with guilt, but she didn't respond. She couldn't. I paced the room, my mind racing. Every single moment of our marriage now felt like a lie, twisted by this affair I hadn't seen coming. I wanted to scream, to break something, to run away and never look back, but I couldn't escape the weight pressing down on my chest. And then the anger shifted. The betrayal that had consumed me began to focus on something else. Revenge. I had come here thinking I'd get even. I had wanted to hurt her the way she had hurt me, and in a sick twist of fate, I had almost done it. But the game had backfired, and now all that was left was the ruins of my marriage. "I agreed to this," I muttered bitterly, pacing the floor. "I was going to sleep with Jason's mistress to get back at you. I wanted to make you feel what I was feeling. And now," Rachel gasped, her eyes wide. "What?" she whispered. You were going to cheat on me too?" The irony of her shock almost made me laugh. Here she was, the woman who had already betrayed me, stunned at the idea that I could have done the same. But I didn't laugh. Couldn't. All I could do was stare at her, wondering how we had ended up so far from the life we had promised each other. "Why shouldn't I have?" I asked, my voice cold. "You already did. You broke us." Rachel shook her head violently, her sobs coming harder now. "I didn't know. I swear, Matt, I didn't know it would be you. I never wanted this. I just felt so lost, and Jason was there, and..." I cut her off, unable to listen anymore. Her excuses didn't matter. Her reasons didn't matter. The damage was done. And yet, as I stood there, staring at the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world, I felt something else stir inside me. Something I hadn't expected. A sick, twisted sense of pity. For both of us. We were broken, yes, but we hadn't just broken each other. We had broken ourselves, in ways I didn't even understand yet. "I can't do this," I muttered, turning toward the door. I can't be here." Rachel's voice cracked as she called after me, desperate and raw. "Matt, wait, please. We can talk about this, we can fix it." But I was already walking down the hall, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay. Couldn't look at her. I couldn't even face Jason, who had likely been eavesdropping the whole time. Everything felt like a nightmare. A surreal nightmare where the world had been turned upside down, and I didn't know how to wake up. I stumbled out of the bedroom and into the hallway, my legs shaky, my mind a tangled mess of anger, disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to grief. Grief for the life I thought I had, for the marriage I believed in, for the trust that had been shattered in ways I couldn't even fully process yet. Jason was leaning against the wall just outside the door. His arms crossed casually like this was just another Friday night. When he saw me, though, he straightened up, sensing something was wrong. His smirk was gone, replaced with a puzzled look. "What the hell just happened in there?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" I didn't answer. I didn't have the energy to even look at him. Instead, I kept walking, past the front door, out into the cold night air. I needed space. I needed to breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in with every step I took. Jason followed me outside, his voice now tinged with confusion and a bit of panic. Matt, what's going on? Why is Rachel here? That stopped me. I turned to face him, my fists clenched at my sides. How could he not know? He had been bragging about her for weeks. He had rubbed his affair in my face without even realizing who he was talking about. Why is Rachel here? I repeated, my voice shaking with rage. You've been sleeping with her, Jason. My wife. Rachel is the married woman you've been sneaking around with. And I just walked in on her in your bed. Jason's face went pale. He looked stunned. Like the words I was saying didn't make sense in his head. Wait, what? No, that can't be. Rachel's your wife? He stammered, shaking his head as if trying to connect the dots. Man, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was her. I didn't care if he knew. I didn't care about his excuses. The betrayal was too fresh, too deep. Every time he had bragged about his mistress, every time he had joked about her husband being clueless, he had been talking about me. The realization twisted in my gut, making me feel sick. You've got to be kidding me? I muttered, pacing in the driveway. All this time, you had no idea it was Rachel? And I had no idea the woman you were screwing was my wife. You've been rubbing it in my face this whole time. Jason took a step back, raising his hands defensively. Look, Matt, I didn't know. Okay? You've got to believe me. I never would have done this if I'd known she was your wife. I thought it was just some random married woman. I couldn't listen to him anymore. His words were hollow, meaningless. The damage was done, and nothing he said could fix it. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to punch him, to let all the anger and betrayal pour out in one violent moment. But I didn't. What would that change? Hitting Jason wouldn't erase what had happened. It wouldn't undo the fact that Rachel had betrayed me. I can't deal with this, I said, my voice tight with emotion. I need to get out of here. Jason nodded, still looking pale, like he was afraid I might actually take a swing at him. Yeah, man, I get it. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't respond. I didn't want his apology. What good was it now? I turned away from him, heading for my car. I needed to leave. I needed to be anywhere but here. As I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door, I caught a glimpse of Rachel standing in the doorway. She had pulled on a robe, her face streaked with tears, watching me with a look of pure devastation. She knew it was over. We both did. Whatever hope she had of fixing this, whatever promises she might make, it didn't matter anymore. I revved the engine, not looking back as I pulled away from Jason's house. The further I drove, the more the world outside blurred into nothingness. My mind was racing, but I didn't know what to focus on. Should I be angrier at Rachel or at Jason? Or at myself, for not seeing the signs sooner? For letting myself get sucked into this mess in the first place? I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to move, to escape the crushing weight of everything that had just happened. Every memory, every happy moment Rachel and I had shared felt tainted now, stained by the knowledge of what she had done. We had been married 5 years. I thought we had built something solid. We had our ups and downs, like any couple, but I never imagined it would end like this. Her lying naked in another man's bed, while I stood there, stunned and broken. I wasn't sure how long I drove, but eventually, I found myself in front of my brother's house. It was late, but I didn't care. I parked the car, my heart still pounding in my chest, and sat there for a moment, trying to summon the strength to get out. When I finally did, I walked up to the door, my legs weak, my entire body numb. I knocked quietly, hoping he was still awake, or at least wouldn't be too pissed about me showing up unannounced. The door opened a crack, and I saw Luke's face, bleary-eyed and confused. "Matt?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing here, man?" It's the middle of the night. I didn't even know how to explain it. How could I tell him that my wife had been cheating on me for months, with the last person I ever would have suspected? "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke didn't ask any more questions. He could see from the look on my face that something was wrong. He stepped aside, letting me into the house, and closed the door softly behind me. We sat in his living room, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me harder than ever. I stared at the floor, trying to find the words. "Rachel," I finally said, my throat tightening. "She's been cheating on me." Luke didn't say anything, just waited. He knew me well enough to know I needed time. So I told him everything. The texts I found, the night with Jason, walking in on her in his bed. As the words spilled out, I could feel the last shreds of my control slipping away. By the time I finished, Luke was shaking his head in disbelief. "Man, I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry, Matt." I nodded, my eyes burning. "Yeah, me too." And for the first time that night, I let the tears come. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was heartbroken, and it hit me all at once, harder than I expected. I wasn't sure how I was supposed to move forward from here. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days after that night blurred together. I stayed at Luke's place for a while, trying to make sense of everything, but there wasn't much to figure out. Rachel had betrayed me, and Jason had been complicit in it. No amount of apologies or explanations could undo the damage. What hurt the most was that I'd been blindsided by people I trusted. Rachel reached out, of course. She called, texted, over and over. Messages asking me to talk, to come home, to at least meet with her so we could discuss what had happened. I ignored her for the first few days, but each time her name popped up on my phone, it was like a punch to the gut. I didn't know if I was ready to face her yet, but I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. Luke tried his best to keep me distracted, taking me out to grab beers, even pulling out old video games we hadn't touched since college. But no matter what I did, my mind kept going back to that bedroom, to the look on Rachel's face when I walked in, and the broken pieces of what had once been our life together. By the end of the week, I felt like I was drowning. Sitting in Luke's living room, staring at the ceiling while the TV droned on in the background, I knew I couldn't keep running. I needed answers. I needed closure. So I called her. "Matt." Rachel's voice was small on the other end of the line, filled with cautious hope. "I've been trying to. Can we meet?" I cut her off, not interested in hearing her apologies right now. "We need to talk." She was silent for a moment, probably surprised I hadn't hung up already. "Yeah, of course. Anytime. Where do you want to meet?" I didn't want to go home, not yet, and I definitely didn't want to meet anywhere that might remind me of us. "The park near Old Ridge," I said, remembering the quiet place we used to walk before things went to hell. "Tomorrow noon." "Okay," she whispered. "I'll be there." The next day, I sat on a bench, the cold October wind biting through my jacket. The trees around me were in full fall bloom, their leaves fiery reds and oranges, drifting slowly to the ground. I waited, wondering how I'd even begin this conversation. Nothing felt right. Nothing could feel right after what had happened. Rachel showed up, her face pale and drawn. She wore a coat that I recognized. It was one I'd bought her for our 3rd anniversary. Somehow, the sight of it made everything worse, like she was trying to remind me of a time when things were good between us. A time that felt like a lifetime ago now. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension between us was thick, suffocating, filled with all the words we didn't want to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered, breaking the silence first. Her voice was trembling, and her eyes were already welling up with tears. "Matt, I don't know what to say. I know I've hurt you. I know I've ruined everything. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to unleash all the rage and betrayal that had been eating away at me since I found out. But looking at her now, so broken, so different from the woman I had fallen in love with, I couldn't." "Why, Rachel?" I asked, my voice flat, exhausted. "I need to know why." She bit her lip, wiping at her tears. I don't know," she admitted, shaking her head. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but it's the truth. I was lonely. I felt like you were pulling away, like you were so focused on work, and I know that's no excuse. But Jason was there, and I made a horrible mistake." I swallowed the bitterness that rose in my throat. "You could have talked to me. You could have told me you were feeling that way. I know, she said, her voice cracking. I know I should have, but I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't care. Afraid I wasn't enough anymore. That's not true, I said, though my words lacked the strength I wanted them to have. The truth was, maybe I had been distracted. Maybe I hadn't noticed how distant we'd become. But that didn't justify what she'd done. Nothing could. I ended it with Jason before you found out, she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the ground. I knew it was wrong. I hated myself for it. That night, I didn't know it was you coming to the house, Matt. I swear I didn't know. Her words felt like cold comfort. The damage was already done. Do you love him? I asked, though the question felt like a knife twisting in my own chest. Rachel shook her head violently. No, I don't. It was never about love, Matt. It was a stupid, selfish mistake. I love you. I never stopped loving you. I let the words sink in, but they didn't offer me any solace. Love. What did that even mean anymore? Could I believe her? Could I forgive her? The betrayal still clung to me like a shadow, darkening every memory, every promise we'd made to each other. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice small, defeated. I don't know how we're supposed to move forward from this. Rachel reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on top of mine. We can fix this, she whispered, her voice pleading. I know we can. Please, I don't want to lose you. I looked down at her hand on mine, the warmth of her touch familiar but foreign all at once. I had once loved her so deeply, so completely. But now I didn't know what I felt. Everything was tangled in a web of pain and betrayal. I don't know if I can trust you again, I said, pulling my hand away. How am I supposed to believe anything after this? Rachel's face crumpled, and she started crying again, her sobs shaking her entire body. I'll do anything, Matt, she begged. Please, I'll go to therapy, I'll never speak to Jason again. I'll do whatever it takes. Just, please don't leave me. Her desperation hit me like a wave, pulling me under. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to cling to the hope that maybe we could find a way back to each other. But the other part, the part that had seen her in Jason's bed, the part that knew she had lied to me for months, couldn't let go of the anger. I need time, I said, my voice barely audible. I don't know if I can give you what you're asking for right now. Rachel nodded, wiping her eyes. Take all the time you need, she whispered. I'll wait. I'll wait for as long as it takes. I stood up, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me like 1,000 pounds. I'll call you, I said, turning away from her, my heart heavy. As I walked away, I heard her sobbing behind me, but I didn't turn around. Couldn't. There was no easy answer here, no clear path forward. All I knew was that the life I had built with Rachel, the trust, the love, the future we had planned was gone. And I didn't know if I'd ever be able to find my way back to it again. The following days passed in a haze. I returned to Luke's place, but it felt like I was living on autopilot. Wake up, go to work, come back, eat something, sleep or at least try to. Everything seemed muted, like I was watching my own life from a distance. Luke was supportive, but even he couldn't pull me out of the fog I was in. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts always circled back to Rachel, to the life we had before everything went to hell. I kept replaying our conversation at the park. Her tears, her apologies, the desperation in her voice as she begged me not to leave her. I believed she was sorry. I could see it in her eyes. But what she'd done, it wasn't something that could be erased with a few words or promises. The trust was gone, shattered into pieces I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to put back together. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the part of me that missed her. The part that still saw Rachel as the woman I had fallen in love with years ago, the woman I had built a life with. The memories of us, before everything went wrong, kept resurfacing. Our wedding day, the vacations, the nights we spent laughing on the couch over some dumb TV show. That woman was still there somewhere. But I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. After nearly a week of silence, I called her. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe it was the loneliness creeping in, Or maybe it was the nagging sense that I couldn't just walk away without trying to make sense of things. Either way, I found myself dialing her number late one evening, the phone heavy in my hand as it rang. Rachel picked up almost immediately. "Matt." Her voice was soft, tentative. I could hear the hope in it, the cautious relief that I hadn't disappeared completely. "Yeah, it's me," I said, my own voice sounding foreign to me. "I've been thinking, maybe we should try therapy." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. I wasn't sure if she was crying or just too stunned to speak. When she finally answered, her voice was shaky. "Really? You want to try?" "I don't know if it's going to fix anything," I admitted, the truth weighing heavy on my chest. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to try. I need to understand what happened, Rachel. I need to hear it from you with a professional there to help us sort through it. I can't do this alone." "I'll do anything, Matt," she whispered, her voice filled with a kind of desperate hope that made my heart ache. "I'll go to therapy. I'll do whatever it takes. I just want a chance to make things right." I wasn't sure there was a way to make things right, but therapy felt like a step, at least. A way to confront the truth head-on, with someone who could help us make sense of it. I didn't know what the outcome would be. Maybe we'd end up walking away from each other for good. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something left to salvage. The first session was harder than I expected. We met with a therapist named Dr. Michaels, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I wasn't sure how this would work. I had never been to therapy before, and the idea of talking about my marriage, my pain, in front of a stranger felt uncomfortable. Rachel was a wreck when we walked in. She could barely look at me, her hands wringing together in her lap. I tried to keep my emotions in check, to stay as detached as possible, but being in the same room with her brought everything back to the surface. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion. Dr. Michaels started by asking us both to talk about why we were there. Rachel spoke first, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. She took responsibility, admitted her affair with Jason, and broke down crying more than once. Hearing her describe it, hearing her say the words out loud in front of me, was like reliving the betrayal all over again. But there was something raw in the way she spoke, something vulnerable. She wasn't trying to make excuses. She was owning up to what she had done, and that, at least, was something. When it was my turn to talk, the words came out more easily than I expected. I talked about the day I found out, how I had confronted her with the texts, how I had walked in on her in Jason's bedroom. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I laid it all out. My anger, my hurt, my inability to trust her anymore. I told her I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. Dr. Michaels listened patiently, offering guidance where needed, but mostly letting us talk. It was hard, harder than I thought it would be. But for the first time, we were finally confronting the truth of what had happened, not just skirting around it or avoiding the hard conversations. At the end of the session, Dr. Michaels gave us some things to think about. She didn't promise us a quick fix. She made it clear that rebuilding trust, if it was even possible, would take time. A lot of time. And even then, there were no guarantees. We had to decide if we were both willing to put in the work. As we left the office, Rachel turned to me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Do you think we can get through this?" I stared at her for a long moment, trying to find the answer inside myself. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to try. I'm not promising anything, Rachel. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to trust you again. But I think we owe it to ourselves to see if there's anything left." The therapy sessions continued for the next few weeks. Some days were better than others. Some days I walked out feeling like we were making progress, like maybe there was a glimmer of hope. Other days, I felt like we were just fooling ourselves, trying to patch up something that was too broken to fix. But Rachel was trying. I could see that. She was doing everything Dr. Michaels suggested, giving me space, being transparent about where she was, who she was with. She even quit her job to avoid any chance of running into Jason again. It was a drastic move, but she seemed committed to showing me she was serious about rebuilding what we had lost. I wasn't sure if it was enough. The trust was still shattered. I still had moments where I'd look at her and wonder how she could have done this to us. how she could have thrown away everything we had built together. But there were other moments, brief, fleeting moments, where I'd catch a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman who had once been my best friend, my partner, my everything. In those moments, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. It wasn't until our 5th session that I finally admitted the truth I had been avoiding. "I'm still angry," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I looked at Rachel across the room. "I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry." Rachel nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "I know," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm not giving up on us, Matt. I won't." Dr. Michael spoke softly, her voice calm and steady. "Anger is a natural part of this process, Matt. And Rachel, it's important that you understand that this isn't something that can be rushed. Rebuilding trust takes time, sometimes more time than we expect. But the fact that you're both here, working through this together, shows that you're both still committed to finding a way." Committed. That word echoed in my mind long after the session ended. I wasn't sure what the future held. I didn't know if we'd ever truly repair the damage that had been done. But I was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of hope. The weeks turned into months, and Rachel and I continued our therapy sessions. We didn't stop after the 5th session, even though part of me wanted to. It was hard, really hard. Some days I questioned whether it was worth it, whether dragging ourselves through this emotional minefield was the right choice. But I didn't give up, and neither did she. Every session unearthed something new. More hurt, more guilt, sometimes even small bits of hope. We talked about things I had buried deep, how my long hours at work had put a strain on us, how we had drifted without really seeing it happen. Rachel admitted to the loneliness she felt, the fear that I had stopped caring. And I finally told her about that gnawing feeling of inadequacy that had plagued me for months. The feeling that maybe, no matter how hard I worked or how much I gave, it would never be enough. I realized, slowly, that it wasn't just the affair that had broken us. The affair had been a symptom, not the disease itself. We had stopped communicating. We had stopped paying attention to each other. I had retreated into work, and Rachel had found comfort in someone else. That realization didn't absolve her of what she'd done. It didn't make her betrayal any less painful. But it did help me understand how we had ended up here. How we had both contributed, in our own ways, to the collapse of our marriage. About 3 months into therapy, I moved back home. It wasn't a grand, romantic gesture, and it wasn't because everything was suddenly fixed. It was more practical than anything else. Luke's place had been a lifeline when I needed space, but it wasn't sustainable. We couldn't pretend forever that my life hadn't fallen apart. Eventually, I had to confront the wreckage I had left behind. Rachel was cautious when I returned. She didn't push me, didn't overwhelm me with expectations. She let me set the pace. We were like two strangers sharing the same house, tiptoeing around each other, afraid to disturb the fragile peace we were trying to build. But even that, as uncomfortable as it was, felt like progress. Some nights, we'd sit on the couch and watch TV in silence, the distance between us palpable. Other nights, we'd really talk about things we hadn't talked about in years. About our fears, our regrets, the things we wanted but had never said out loud. One night, after a particularly difficult therapy session, I asked her the question that had been haunting me for months. The one I had never had the courage to ask before. "Why didn't you just leave?" Rachel looked at me, her face drawn and tired, and sighed. "I thought about it," she admitted. "There were times when I wondered if I should just walk away. But I couldn't leave you, Matt. Even after everything, I still loved you. I know it doesn't make sense, and I know I don't deserve for you to believe that, but it's the truth. I didn't leave because I couldn't imagine my life without you in it." Her words cut deep, but in a strange way, they also soothed something inside me. I didn't know if I believed her fully, but hearing her say it mattered. It didn't fix anything, it didn't erase the pain, but it mattered. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday night. It wasn't dramatic. There was no big fight or emotional breakthrough. It was just quiet. Rachel and I were sitting at the dinner table, eating takeout because neither of us had the energy to cook. The silence between us wasn't heavy like it had been before. It was different, more comfortable somehow. Rachel glanced up at me, her eyes tired but soft. "I miss you," she said quietly, breaking the silence. I looked back at her, feeling a knot in my throat that I hadn't expected. "I miss you too." And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. But it was the first time since this whole mess began that I didn't feel like we were drowning. I didn't feel like I was suffocating under the weight of everything that had happened. That night, for the first time in months, we slept in the same bed. It wasn't romantic. There were no whispered words or passionate reconciliations. But it was something, a small step toward rebuilding what had been broken. The months that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. Some days it felt like we were making progress, like we were clawing our way back to something resembling normalcy. Other days, the wounds felt fresh again, and I'd wonder if we were just fooling ourselves. The trust wasn't fully there yet, and maybe it never would be. But Rachel was trying, and so was I. We took things slowly. There was no rush. I didn't want to pretend like everything was fine when it wasn't. But little by little, the walls between us started to come down. We laughed together again, something I thought might never happen. We talked about our future, cautiously, like we were afraid to jinx it. And for the first time in a long time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild. One night, about 6 months after I had moved back in, Rachel asked me if I thought we were going to make it. I thought about it for a long moment, staring at the ceiling as we lay in bed, side by side. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think we're both still here, and that counts for something." Rachel turned to look at me, her expression soft but serious. "It does count. It counts a lot." There was a long pause, and then she reached out, tentatively, and took my hand. It was a small gesture, one that shouldn't have meant much, but it did. It felt like the first real connection we'd had in a long time. "I'm still scared," I admitted. "I'm scared I'll never be able to trust you again." "I know," Rachel whispered, squeezing my hand. "I'm scared too, but I'm not giving up, Matt. Not on us." I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if we were going to make it, if we'd ever be able to rebuild the life we had lost. But I knew one thing for certain. We were both still fighting for it. And that had to mean something. The road ahead wasn't easy. It was long, winding, and filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't walking it alone. Rachel and I had a lot of work to do, years of trust to rebuild, years of pain to heal. But we were moving forward one step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Because sometimes, in the wreckage of what's been lost, you find something new, something worth fighting for. If this story made you reflect or sparked any thoughts, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new real and shocking stories about unfaithful wives. Your support helps us share more stories like this one. See you in the next video.